Hi everyone, welcome back to this GRE crash course. If you've been with us from the beginning, we just finished up the analytical writing sections and we're about to launch into the verbal reasoning. And so today we'll just do a brief overview of the verbal reasoning and then get right into the first type of question, which is text completion. In earlier videos, we looked at the whole test and the scoring and the breakdown and all that. So if you're more interested in that, I would go check out one of those videos. For right now, we're just going to be looking at the verbal section, the questions and strategies. But just a brief overview, your verbal score is going to be based on two sections of verbal questions. Now, again, because there is that experimental or that mock section in the test, you might end up with three, but your score is only based on two of those sections. And each section of verbal is going to contain 20 questions, and you'll have 30 minutes to complete that full set of 20 questions. So within the 20 questions, there'll be three types of questions. The first type is text completion, which is what we're going to look at today. And then in subsequent videos, we'll look at the reading comprehension as well as the sentence equivalence. Out of the 20 questions, you can anticipate there being about 7 text completion questions. And if you've never seen these before, we're going to look at some examples shortly. But generally, what you have is either a sentence or a paragraph with 1, 2, or 3 blanks in it. And your job is simply to fill in the blanks. Whatever word matches the meaning of the sentence or paragraph is the correct answer. There is no partial credit, so on 2 and 3 blank questions, it doesn't matter if you get 1 or 2 of those blanks correct. If you don't get all of the blanks correct, it just counts as a wrong answer. The main thrust of this video is just going to be going through practice questions and trying to develop some text completion strategies, ones that are either recommended by ETS, some of the things that I've read in prep books, or just like patterns and hints and shortcuts that I've found that work well with the students that I tutor. So to start things off, the first and probably the most common piece of advice that's given for this type of question is read the passage and try to fill in the blanks mentally before looking at the answer choices. And all this is meant to do is to prevent you from being biased by the choices there and forces you to like sort of take into account what is the sentence trying to say and then going to the answers to look for something that matches the meaning you think the sentence ought to have. So in an attempt to simulate the test experience as closely as possible, I sort of mocked up what the test will look like. And you'll see this if you take some of the practice tests on the ETS website, and this is roughly what your screen will look like come test day. So to start off with, I'm just going to give 3 questions here in sequence, and some of these are pulled from old ETS tests. So if you've been working off a lot of material, you might have seen these before. But essentially, I'm going to go through these 3 questions, and I want you to just pause the video and take about a minute or 2 for each question to see if you can come up with an answer. Let's start with this single blank question. So if you took the time to go through it, you came up with an answer. One thing you might have noticed, maybe you're unfamiliar with the word tortuous. It looks a lot like torturous, but it doesn't mean the same thing. So tortuous actually means, at least when you're talking about like a book or something, would be something that's excessively lengthy and complex or convoluted. So let's read through it and try to come up with a word for that blank before looking at the answers. Many find it strange that her writing is thought to be tortuous, lengthy and complex. Her recent essays, although longer than most of her earlier essays, are extremely blank. So if people find it strange that she's thought to be tortuous, then our blank needs to be not tortuous, right? And although it is longer, okay, so it is lengthy, it's got to be not complex. So the word that I'm looking for here is something synonymous with not complex, right? And so if we look down at our options, we can already eliminate most of them, right? Painstaking does not work. Tedious definitely doesn't work. Insightful and sophisticated, even though they're positive words, they don't mean the opposite of complex. Something can definitely be complex and insightful, or complex and sophisticated, which leaves us only with clear, which is a pretty good antonym for something that is tortuous, right? Something that's convoluted. The opposite would, of course, be clear. Next up, taking a look at this 2 blank question. The unironic representation of objects from everyday life is blank serious American art of the 20th century. high artists ceded the straightforward depiction of the blank to illustrators, advertisers, and packaging designers. So the operative word here is definitely the word cede. So if you're not familiar with it, it's going to be a tough question. So to cede is to give up control or power over something. So these high artists, which we should probably see as the same as these serious artists, right? Serious or high quote unquote artists are probably the same people. They gave up the straightforward depiction to other people. So, looking at that first part of the sentence, the unironic representation of objects from everyday life, well, that sounds a lot like the straightforward depiction, right? It was apparently ceded, so we probably want a word like they gave it up, or they gave it away. And then in the second part, the depiction of the blank to illustrators, advertisers, and packaging designers. So here, the unironic representation of objects from everyday life, what matches that best for the second one is probably going to be something like normal or commonplace. So looking down at our options, we can see for blank one, we have missing from, valued in, crucial to. So if you were sort of thinking it might be valued in, it might be crucial to, and you couldn't really make up your mind, it might have been that you weren't paying enough attention to the second half of the sentence. Because if you just take that first half of the sentence, all three of those options read just fine. It's really about taking into account this word cede, right? So the first one is definitely missing from. We want to match that idea of ceding something. And then in the second half, we want to match the idea of what is being ceded, the representations of objects from everyday life, which is commonplace stuff. And lastly, we have this three blank question. So I am going to try to put on screen the definitions for some of the more difficult words or the ones that I find people get tripped up on. For some of you, you already know these, it's not a big deal, but I thought it would be nice to just have those there as a reference. Okay, so if one could don magic spectacles with lenses that make the murky depths of the ocean become transparent, and look back several centuries to an age before widespread abuse of the oceans began, even the most blank observer would quickly discover that fish were formerly much more abundant. So already, and it's not always a great idea to just answer the blanks as they come, but in this case, I can already get a sense that it's going to be a word like even the most normal observer, even the most unintelligent or someone who knows nothing about this would be able to see this, right? Unsuspecting. All right. Likewise, many now depleted species of marine animal would appear blank. All right, so the word likewise is pretty key here. They want us to match the same meaning as the sentence before. And so the sentence before said, you would quickly see that fish were formerly much more abundant. So likewise, these marine animals would also appear more abundant. So we want a word like abundant. And for the last sentence, but without such special glasses, the difference between past and present oceans are indeed hard to blank. Probably a word like see, right? Without these glasses, it would be hard to see these differences. So now looking at our answers, what do we have? Well, for our first blank, we have casual, right? Exactly what we wanted. Just like a normal observer, someone who's not interested, doesn't know too much about it. For the second one, we want a word like abundant, and we have plentiful. And for the third blank, we want a word like see or understand, right? And discern is right there. So we've got a good match on all three blanks. So our first strategy of trying to mentally fill in these blanks is pretty applicable to all questions. I wouldn't get hung up on it if it's eating up a lot of time, especially for some questions, like a few of those that we did. It's not that we need an exact word that we would put there, but just a sense of, I think it needs to be a synonym for this or an antonym for this, or just sort of saying, I think it should be a positive word or a negative word. That might be enough to take with you to the answers to make sure that you aren't doing something terribly incorrect. So the next thing that we want to talk about, another strategy, is you don't want to bring in outside information. You don't want to bring in your own personal bias, right? So everything you need to answer the question is in the passage. And so if you find yourself overworking the passage, reading into it too much, bringing in information that another test taker wouldn't have just because they happen to not know information, you're probably doing too much. There's probably a much easier, more superficial answer there in the passage. Let's take a look at a question where we might want to put this strategy to use. So this one here, take about a minute, pause the video, and go ahead and work through it. This filmmaker is not outspoken on political matters. Her films are known for their aesthetic qualities rather than for their blank ones. So a mistake that some people might make is just think, well, I just need to get the opposite of aesthetic, right? Her films are known for their aesthetics, not their blank. Well, a natural opposite for aesthetics might be narrative, right? Maybe you know of films that just go for flashy looks as opposed to telling a good story. And that might be true, but given this sentence, especially the first half of it, this filmmaker is not outspoken on political matters. We need to match that meaning. We need to match the meaning that is given to us. We don't need to make up our own meaning for this sentence. And so we have this option here, polemical, relating to or involving something strongly critical, controversial, or disputatious, which is precisely what it means if something is political, right? So if she's not outspoken on political matters, then her films are probably not known for their polemical qualities. And that is the right answer. But let's say that I change this question a little bit. Let's say I rewrote the first half of it. This filmmaker has not often been concerned with the market viability of her work. Her films are known for their aesthetic qualities rather than for their blank ones. So what I've done here is I've gotten rid of that whole thing about political, right? And so the sentence is no longer suggesting to us that we need to match this idea of her not being political. Rather, we need to match the idea of her not being concerned with the market viability of her work. And so what makes more sense now would be a word like commercial, right? And so you definitely want to pay attention to what is the sentence trying to say. And this is especially true with one blank questions. Almost always you're going to have this two-part setup, right, with a colon or a semicolon, and you're looking for an idea or even just a word that you can match or find an antonym for on the other half of the sentence. Let's take a look at one more example of a situation where people's bias can sometimes lead them down the wrong path. So again, pause the video, take about a minute, work through this one if you can. Technology seems to be advancing blank in our country today. Regulatory systems and prolonged legal battles over copyright and ownership have made innovative processes more cumbersome than ever before. So, one of the problems that I see a lot of people make is that they get stuck on just that first half, right? It says technology seems to be advancing blank in our country today. And so a lot of people, their first thought is a word like exponential, because when you say technology and advancing, right, you think of things like science, you think of progress, you think of exponential advancing in progress, right? Um, but the thing is that the second half of the sentence says that these processes are cumbersome. They're slow, complicated, and inefficient. So exponentially is definitely wrong, but it's an answer that I see people put for a question like this if they're not reading closely. And so looking at our other options, we need something that matches this cumbersome speed, right? Slow, complicated, inefficient. And our best answer is definitely going to be sluggishly, which is directly opposed to what people's natural instinct might be when they see something like, oh, technology advancing, right? So just be careful of your own personal bias. Make sure that you are matching the meaning of the sentence, not the meaning you think the sentence ought to have. The next strategy I want to talk about is learning to anticipate paradoxical or contradictory statements. So in these questions, the GRE only has a few sentences to try to set up something interesting or something difficult as a question. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to just play against what they know people will assume. All right. And we kind of saw that with that last question about technology advancing slowly, right? It sort of plays against what you would expect. And let's take a look at a question that also exemplifies this. Take a minute to work through this one. A newly published laudatory biography of George Bernard Shaw fails, like others before it, to capture the essence of his personality. The more he is blank, the more his true self seems to blank. So, laudatory, in this sense, means that these biographies are speaking well of him, right? But they do seem to fail. They aren't able to capture the essence of his personality. So we need to match this idea of that the more he's written about, right, the more we don't know about him. So if we look at the first blank, uh, discussed, disparaged, disregarded. Well, it's not negative, right? People are praising him, so we can't really pick those last two. We have to pick something neutral like discussed. But then for the second blank, and this is where if you're just reading casually, if you're just trying to make that second half of the sentence make sense, you might be tempted to pick something like emerge or coalesce, right? Because both of those sort of read just fine, just the second half, right? The more he is discussed, the more his true self seems to emerge. Well, that's usually what happens with most people, right? The more you read about them or the more they're written about, the more people know about them. But the first half of the sentence told us that we should expect something contradictory, right? Something sort of paradoxical. The more that of these biographies that are written they seem to always fail to capture the essence of his personality. So it's disappear. These next two strategies go hand in hand, and both of them are most applicable for three blank questions, although slightly for two blank questions. So first off, don't assume that you should answer the blanks in order. All right, a lot of people, when they first start off, they just go through one, two, three, and they try to answer it. That isn't often the best way to do it. Also, for the longer passages, it's best to read through the whole thing for holistic meaning first, because you're not just trying to match the meaning of that portion of the sentence. You're not even just trying to match the meaning of that sentence. Oftentimes, for three blank questions, you need to match the overall meaning of the entire paragraph, and you're only going to get that if you've read the whole thing through and you've been able to sort of infer what the meaning of the paragraph needs to be. Let's take a look at a practice question using these strategies. So again, go ahead, take this question. All right. The question of blank in photography has lately become non-trivial. So right away, if you try to answer that first blank at this point, you're not going to have any idea. None of these answers make any sense given the context, right? Could forgery be non-trivial? Yes. Could influence be non-trivial? Yes. Could style be non-trivial? Of course, right? So all these things could work. We don't know yet. So we're just going to keep reading. Prices for vintage prints, those made by a photographer soon after he or she made the negative, so drastically blanked in the 1990s that one of these photographs might fetch 100 times as much as a non-vintage print of the same image. Okay, so right there, I can actually answer the second blank, right? This one is probably the one that stands alone on its own. We know that one of these photographs is worth 100 times as much as this other one, right? And so the idea that prices are ballooning is what's being suggested to us here. All right, so that's good. That's giving some context to the statement, to the sentence. It was perhaps only a matter of time before someone took advantage of the blank to peddle newly created vintage prints for profit. Okay, so now we have this idea of people peddling quote unquote vintage prints. So it sounds like they're creating counterfeits or something. And so now we look back at the first blank and forgery makes a whole lot of sense, right? The paragraph has nothing to say about influence or style. It's all about the prices of these photographs and people trying to make new vintage prints for profit, right? And so now we can go back and answer that one. And now, given the context we have, the last blank, is it going to be discrepancy, ambiguity, or duplicity? Well, what is it that people are taking advantage of, right? It says took advantage of the blank. So we know it's whatever was talked about in the previous sentence, and there they're talking about this discrepancy in price, right? That's what people are taking advantage of. So you can see here, if we were to just go through 1, 2, 3 and try to answer it, we probably would have messed up. So something to keep in mind on these longer passages, read through the whole thing, try to get an idea for it, and answer the blanks in whatever order makes the most sense to you. And then when you're done, go back and reread the whole thing with those words in the blanks and see if it makes sense as an entire unit. This next strategy is a bit risky. It's more of like a last-ditch effort kind of thing. So if two choices are near enough in meaning, you can eliminate them both. So you can use this sometimes, and you want to be careful, right? Because on the GRE, they are giving you words that have very specific meanings and often carry subtle connotations. So it's not enough to just say, oh, those two are probably synonymous, I can get rid of them both. This is really something for particular situations where you don't really know what you should put into a blank, but you do recognize that two of them accomplish almost the exact same thing. If you think back to this question from our first set, that first blank, the unironic representations of objects from everyday life is blank serious American art of the 20th century. So maybe when you were working through this, you just had no idea, right? Unironic representations, what does that even mean? I don't even know, but it's probably important, right? And maybe that's what you're thinking. And so you go to the answers and you see missing from, valued in, crucial to. The problem with that is that valued in and crucial to read almost the same, right? If something is valued in or if it's crucial to, you're basically saying it's important, right? And so from that standpoint, you might feel okay just eliminating both of them because they both do roughly the same thing. There's no reason to pick one over the other. And again, if we look at another question that we did before, the one about the magic glasses looking back on the oceans, and we look at blank 3, But without special glasses, the difference between past and present oceans are indeed hard to. And so we have ignore, discern, dismiss. And again, ignore and dismiss, they don't mean the same thing, but they're pretty close, right? If you read that sentence with ignore in it and dismiss, it gives it the same type of meaning, and it's not clear that one would be better than the other. And so from that point of view, we can kind of eliminate both of them. So again, I wouldn't use this as your first choice, but if you're really struggling to fill in a blank and you just don't have any other strategies to use, see if two of them mean the same thing or near enough that you can feel confident getting rid of them both. The last strategy I want to put forward is that you aren't afraid to guess on a word that you don't know if all the other options seem wrong. So, as you've already seen, and you probably recognize from your own studying, the vocabulary is difficult on this test. And the ETS test makers, they know this, they do this intentionally, and there's going to be questions where you don't know all the words, and you're going to just have to guess. That's the best odds you have for getting a question right. So let's go ahead and look at a situation where this might be the right play. So taking a few moments, just a minute or so to work through this one. Edith Head, known as the Dress Doctor to her contemporaries, was an expert on blank matters. She designed costumes for 11 of Hitchcock's films and was responsible for some of the most memorable dresses worn by Audrey Hepburn and Barbara Stanwyck. So, using our original strategy, what kind of word do we think belongs in here? Probably something like fashion, right? Maybe clothing or costuming or something like that, right? But when we look at our options, we don't see anything. At least, if you're not familiar with some of these words, you probably won't see a word that jumps out at you and says, "Oh yeah, that's a word that means something like fashion or something." Right? And so, what can we do? Well, we can eliminate some, right? We could maybe say, well, there isn't really anything here about narrative, right? There's nothing in here about finances, so those are gone. And if we look at words like maladroit and contrapuntal, we can sort of think, well, the prefix is mal, contra, right? Bad, against. They probably have maybe negative connotations. I don't know. And so maybe we can eliminate those two. And so even though we don't know what sartorial is, we can pick it as our best option. And in fact, sartorial means relating to clothes, which is exactly what we need for our blank. So this strategy isn't foolproof, and really the only reason I put it forward is because I've worked with a lot of people, and certain people, especially intelligent people, have this tendency to twist the meaning of words or to read into the sentence enough to justify a word that they know the definition of so that they can avoid picking a word that they're unfamiliar with. And I would say that this is absolutely the wrong strategy. You don't want to, if you find yourself going through all these hoops to try to make a word work, it probably isn't the right answer. And you're better off just taking a guess. Even if you're just left with maybe two answers you don't know, you're better off taking that 50-50 on a word you don't know than trying to force a word you do know to work when it obviously doesn't. And that brings us to the end of this video on text completion. I know that there are other strategies, there's other things we could have talked about, and if you do have any questions or you just want my take on something you've read in a different book or from a different source, leave a comment. I'll try to get back to you. But this, I think, is a pretty good framework to follow, and it covers a lot of the common mistakes I see people make. So definitely, put this to use, see what works for you. There's no substitute for just doing as many practice tests, practice problems as you can. Um, so I hope this was helpful, and I hope you'll join me in the next video when we go into reading comprehension. Thanks.